And welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so happy to welcome you to today's session of our summer series, Stories and Storytelling. Special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today. We're so pleased to have my teacher and friend and colleague, Rabbi Mychal Springer, teaching us today. Her session is entitled Bechol Dor Vador, How Jewish Storytelling Shapes the Religious Imagination and Orients Us in Time and Space. And we'll be looking especially at the Exodus story and what role it can play for us today. Our sponsor today is my dear sister, Jenna Andelman, who is sponsored at the Chacham level. I'll just read it the way it says it because it's awkward. In gratitude to Rabbi Julia Andelman for her role in creating these extraordinary learning opportunities, and in recognition of the first yard site of our father, a lifelong learner, teacher, and storyteller. He very much was those things, a lifelong learner, teacher, and storyteller, and has inspired both of us in all of those ways so deeply. So Jenna, thank you so much for sponsoring today in honor of me and of Abba. If the rest of the folks joining us today, if you're feeling inspired by the opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we'd love for you to sponsor a session as well. We have 3 sponsorship levels, and you can learn more by contacting Learning Lives at jtsa.edu. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tani for a bit more information.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Just to review the format of today's session, Rabbi Springer will pause for questions periodically throughout our session. You can chat your questions to Rabbi Andelman, and she'll select some of the questions to present to Rabbi Springer. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate private chat with either myself or with Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link this morning. We'll be screen sharing them as well. I'm so pleased to introduce Rabbi Mychal Springer, the manager of clinical pastoral education at New York-Presbyterian Hospital and an adjunct professor at JTS. She founded the Center for Pastoral Education at JTS in 2009. Rabbi Springer was the first conservative rabbi to be certified as an educator by the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education. Her publications include Sisters in Mourning, Daughters Reflecting on Care, Loss, and Meaning with Dr. Suyan Pak. You can read a little more about Rabbi Springer in the bio that was included with the sources. We're so pleased to have her teaching again today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rabbi Springer.
Good afternoon, everybody. So nice to be here with you. And thank you to Tani Schwartz-Herman and Rabbi Andelman for creating this forum and inviting me to be part of it. It's always a pleasure. This is material that I have not taught before, and I'm really excited to bring together a couple of different strands. I started thinking about narrative theory back when I was becoming an ACPE educator, that teaching chaplains how to be chaplains. So that's about 30 years ago that I started immersing myself in narrative theory. And it's something that informs me as a chaplain and as an educator. And when I heard what the title was for this series, I thought that it would be a great opportunity for me to bring together some of the theory and Yetziat Mitzrayim, the coming out of Egypt. At our Seder this past year, I became very interested in the effect that it has on us to tell a story with us having been there, the religious imagination that takes, the way that it shapes us. So I'm going to walk you through some passages that come from the narrative world, and then some passages around Yetziat Mitzrayim, the coming out of Egypt. and we will see how that all comes together. I cannot share my screen.
Oh, just 1 second. I'm gonna.
Okay.
Okay, you should be able to.
Okay. Here we go. So, is that big enough for people? Whoops, that may be a little too big for me. You got it? So I'm beginning with Michael White and David Epstein's book, Narrative Means to Therapeutic Ends. They're big names in the world of narrative theory, which is a postmodern theory for helping people. So, in striving to make sense of life, persons face the task of arranging their experiences of events in sequences across time in such a way as to arrive at a coherent account of themselves and the world around them. So when we tell stories about ourselves, at the center of that activity is moving towards coherence. When we can't tell a story about ourselves, the implication here is that we don't actually know how to make sense of who we are and where we've been. And in a moment, you'll see also where we're going. Specific experiences of events of the past and present, and those that are predicted to occur in the future, must be connected in a lineal sense to developing this account. This account can be referred to as a story or self-narrative. The success of this story of experience provides persons with a sense of continuity and meaning in their lives. And this is relied upon for the ordering of daily lives and for the interpretation of further experiences. Since all stories have a beginning or a history, a middle or a present, and an ending or a future, then the interpretation of current events is as much future shaped as it is past determined. So many of us tell stories, and when we are telling our stories, if we are aware that in doing that, we are participating in accessing where we find meaning in our lives. And sometimes the stories that we tell are missing pieces that we need in order to have a greater sense of our competence. So when we're listening to stories, and in pastoral care, we listen to a lot of stories, we pay attention to the stories that people know how to tell about themselves and the stories that people don't know how to tell about themselves. Because the stories themselves help constitute who we know ourselves to be. One of the things that I really want to call attention to in this first reading here is that the story is both about where we've been and about where we are now and about where we are imagining ourselves to be going in the future. And when we're talking about Jewish stories, this is very important because in connecting ourselves to the Jewish story, we can think of it as being about the past. But if we don't also understand that it is about where we're heading, then we miss that these are the stories that are shaping where we are going. And by connecting to where we've been, we are creating a possible future for ourselves and for the people that we love. And that's really at the heart of what I want to be talking about today. That the past, it might seem like the past, but the meaning of it always moves us into what can be, into the possibilities that the future holds for us. So another book that I love is Encountering the Sacred in Psychotherapy by Melanie, and I'm forgetting her husband's name, Griffith and Griffith. And here they lay out some basic narrative approaches to therapy. So the first is, to a great extent, we are lived by our stories. While we are always shaping and creating our life stories, we are also shaped by the stories we tell about ourselves and are told by others about who we are and can be. Our stories influence to whom we are bound and from whom we are separate. So it is a whole person-making experience, these stories. It's not a superficial matter. And we are very mindful of which stories we tell inside of the Jewish tradition and where we ourselves are situated in relation to them. Sometimes we say that Shabbat keeps the Jews. Well, it's instead of Jews keeping Shabbat, I think it's Heschel who said that, Shabbat keeps the Jews, that the story of Shabbat creates us in time through this marker and the story that we tell about it. We don't just enter into Shabbat as a blank slate. In the Kiddush, we evoke the stories of the creation of the world and Yetziat Mitzrayim, the coming out of Egypt. And those are the stories that then shape every day, every week, how we live, the rhythms of how we live, with whom we live it. Okay, number 2. These stories are not just independent creations by us or our families, but are made within the forces of society, beginning before our birth, in the ways of ancestors, in the ways our ancestors treated others and were treated. Indeed, our stories precede us not only through our bloodlines, but through the forerunners of our racial groups, social class, nationality, gender, and religious group. Previous and present distribution of power among these groups determines who gets a say about what. In this way, the discourses, values, politics, and standards of society in which we live continually open space for or constrain the self-narratives we can entertain. This point, for me, really jumps out in terms of having shared Jewish communal stories that help us to see ourselves as being part of something larger than ourselves. Well, we live in a society that is increasingly atomized or individualized, where there's so much individual choice in terms of how I understand my identity, then understanding that the stories that shape us are not just made by us, but they are stories that come to us out of our social location, out of all that influences us. So if we are Americans, then the ways that being part of the American story influences us, and as Jews, understanding the ways in which Jewish stories shape us. And the fact that there are Jewish stories today, that Jews exist today, I would say is because of the power of these stories that have shaped our identities and have anchored us all around the world in all kinds of situations. But having these stories that shape who we are, that we've inherited, plays a big role in our even being here having this conversation today. The third point here, there's always more lived experience than has yet been put into the stories of ourselves. There are always multiple and sometimes contradictory stories of our identity and relationships, our limits and possibilities. So part of the invitation with Jewish stories is that we continue to bring ourselves. I am not a historically minded person. It's taken me many years to have aspects of Jewish history seep into my brain. But when I was a child and I was studying Torah, one of my teachers, whom I continue to love and give credit to, is a teacher at the Hartman Institute named Noam Tzion. And when we studied Torah with Noam, I was in 6th grade when he was my teacher, and we studied the Torah text and we studied commentaries, and we were particularly immersed in Rashi's commentary. And one of the things that Noam did for me is he gave me a rabbinic name. So every rabbinic name is an acronym, and he called me Rambi, Rav Mychal Bat Yeshayahu. I would say now Rambit, Rav Mychal Bat Yeshayahu V'Torah. And by giving me this name, what he said to me is that in this non-historical world of storytelling, Rashi and I were contemporaneous, and the stories that came through Rashi and the stories that I brought, which were the stories of my lived experience that had not yet been told, they were together enriching what was oral Torah, still being created. And today, always being created, because we bring ourselves and our perspectives and bring that to the story that has not yet been told connected to the stories that have been told. There's always more lived experience than has yet been put into the stories of ourselves. Continually welcoming more that we don't yet know how to tell. So number 4, some narratives about our lives are already known, readily articulated to others, and easily received by them. Some are known to us, but difficult to speak to others. Still others are not yet formed, existing only as sketchy outlines at the edges of awareness. Therapy is a forum to entertain both stories made and stories in the making, and to reflect on which stories one desires to be guided by and which stories one desires to resist. So you can see that this is a pulsating, always changing reality. It's not that there is one story and it has been codified, but the story itself is always being edited and refined and expanded and contracted. And it has an impact on us, what parts of those stories we tell. So sometimes when I'll tell a story, I'll say, oh my God, I never realized this aspect of this story before. And maybe I come to this realization because I'm now in a new moment in my life. And so I approach that story, I understand the meaning of that story differently. Or maybe it's because the person I'm with has a curiosity about an aspect of the story that I never paid attention to before. So today we're in the week of the first Shiva for Rabbi Andelman's father. And a story that I tell in the book that came out last year, Sisters in Mourning, is that by the time my mother died, my mother was ill for quite a while. By the time my mother died, I was sure that I knew everything about her that I needed to know. I felt well provisioned. And as I sat Shiva for my mother and people asked me questions about my mother and the stories that I knew, I felt this chasm open up. And I realized that there was so much more that I did not yet know. And I wondered how I would be able to be at peace in my grief for her with those stories not being able to be told because she was no longer alive. And part of the grieving process was discovering that over time, I could hold the stories I knew and the aspects of them that I didn't know as I wove this new understanding of me and my mother. And it has continued to change, as I'm sure Rabbi Andelman can talk about very powerfully, because you always do. What it means always to continue to be in relationship, and these stories continue to change and grow over time. Okay, and then the 5th one here. Therapists have a particular privilege and responsibility to the people who consult with them as both witness and co-creator of stories of their lives. Due to power imbalances, both within the therapy relationship and within the larger culture in which therapy occurs, the therapist is called to radical listening that listens first and foremost to what the storyteller thinks about the story he or she is telling. The teller's experience about its meaning and primacy are privileged above the therapist's impressions. So the narrative approach here is about curiosity and having a not knowing stance. And for those of us who have overlapping and shared stories, cultivating this not knowing stance is very important, because I can tell you what a story means to me, but I'm very curious what that same story means to you. And we're going to be doing that today with Yetziat Mitzrayim, the coming out of Egypt. To have that not knowing stance that permits somebody to become authoritative about their own life. All right. So another passage from Griffith and Griffith before we delve into Shmot. Rituals and ceremonies thus provide a way for human beings to address that which existentially must remain ambiguous, uncertain, or inchoate. When a relationship breaks up for reasons that cannot be understood, tragedy strikes the life of one who is blameless, or an immigrant grieves silently for his or her lost home. Then life presses the realization that destiny can be neither logical nor just. Ritual and ceremony can provide a capacity to bear that which cannot be understood. And I'm going to use this passage here to jump into our verses that have to do with coming out of Egypt and the way that we tell this story in a highly ritualized way. So at the heart of this story is slavery, is being in the depths, is being marginalized, is being disenfranchised. And our commandment is to tell this story, to make it our own, to understand the ways in which it is a part of our life, whether it's literally coming out of the land of Egypt, or all that that means in its largeness. And for our purposes today, we're really going to be holding what it means to believe that each of us truly and fully came out of Egypt. And what this last reading's passage says is that by taking this storytelling, which is the coming out of Egypt, and making it part of a ritual and a ceremony, it enables us to bear that which cannot be understood. That aspect of experience which is too painful and too difficult can be held in ritual in a way that it cannot be held elsewhere, because other forms don't hold it as fully and as gently as ritual and ceremony can. So that's a powerful tool that we have that shapes Jewish experience very profoundly. I'm just going to pause here, see if there are any comments about the narrative pieces before we delve into Exodus.
We don't so much have questions yet, although I just want to say, because a lot of people are sending me their condolences. So you misspoke, Mychal. You said Shiva, but it's York-Presbyterian. So this is the weekend.
Sorry.
So just so people don't feel the need to send me so many condolences. It's 1 year since my father passed away. We had someone writing who's the child of Holocaust survivors. I'll read you what she wrote. Telling the story was and continues to be essential. I too thought I knew all the stories with its details, but now that both my parents have died, I'm pained to have so many gaps. And to heal, I continue to search for their stories and to tell them to my children and grandchildren. This really is such a sort of couldn't have picked a better session to for my sister to sponsor in memory of our dad, because storytelling was sort of how he approached everything. But you made me think about Shiva a year ago, and how people came and contributed stories that we didn't know. There was someone who came who had been my dad's student 60 years prior, and had these memories of my dad teaching him that were so vivid for him. And it was, it was amazing because it enhanced my own understanding of my dad, but also the stories were completely consistent with ways that he had taught us when we were kids. But you don't remember every detail of how your parents teach you and the stories they tell. So there was this way in which it lifted up stories that I'd forgotten about, and sort of, filled in gaps that hadn't been there, but then are created over time. Anyway, so that's just personal reflection that I indulged in a little bit. Let me just see what else has come in. More people sharing personal reflections. I guess one person is asking how you define a story. I don't know if you want to address that now or not.
That's a great question. I think it's pretty much for the teller to say this is a story. Even a fragment can be a story. An image can be the heart or the seed of a story. So I'm not very particular about what we might call our stories. And one of the things that narrative therapy does is, if you have a story that is where you start, in being engaged with your story, you may discover that there are many other pieces of the story that you hadn't understood or recognized were part of the story you were trying to tell. So for me, stories are dialogical, meaning that they exist between the teller and the hearer as we engage with one another for the creation of the story in that moment. And as I said before, it shifts over time. So if it's okay, Rabbi Endelman, I'll bring us back into the texts. Ready? Okay. So I think that many of us experience that at Seder, where on the one hand, it's the same story and we come back to it every year. On the other hand, every year it's different as it's engaged with who we are in that moment and who's around the table, who's participating with us in the telling of that story. So I hope that's satisfying enough for the person who asked that question. All right, we're coming back to the texts. So in Exodus 13, we read, "V'higadat levincha b'yom hahu lemor, ba'avur zeh asa Adonai li b'tzeti mimitzrayim. And you shall explain to your child on that day, it is because of what God did to me when I went free from Egypt." So contained here is leaving Egypt. So it contains the slavery that Egypt has, the connotation of slavery, and the liberation. And the slavery and the liberation are always intertwined in the telling of this story. So the language here is a little unusual. "V'higadat levincha," you will tell your child. And we're going to look a little bit more about the implications of the telling. And it's said in the first person, "Ba'avur zeh asa Adonai li." God did this for me when I went forth out of Egypt. So there's a timeless present in the telling of this story. And we're going to see how the various commentators deal with this. Okay. So, "V'higadat levincha b'yom hahu," and you must tell your child. This is the positive commandment of relating the story of the Exodus, which applies only on that day. This is in contrast to the earlier verse, "Remember this day," which is an injunction merely to mention the Exodus, but it applies every day. So we have Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim, remembering the leaving of Egypt, and we have the telling of the story, Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. So memory can have this connotation of something from the past, and in the way that the narrative theory was telling us, the telling of a story as it shapes who we are is always about the past, the present, and the future. And I think that the language of the verse actually echoes that very beautifully here. So Or HaChaim comes at it a little bit differently and says, "Od yotze be'omro lemor, lihiyot she'amar, v'higadat levincha tinach, im yesh lo ben, im ein lo ben, yeh patur." So this is looking at the if we go back to the verse itself, "You shall tell your child on that day, saying." This word lemor is the problem here. Why do you need a second saying? It would work fine. The verse would work fine if it was just "and you shall tell your child on that day." And then we'll say what you say. Why do you need this second verb of saying? So what the Or HaChaim is saying is, if you didn't have this word lemor, you would just think that since you're supposed to tell your child, or literally, you could say that's your son. So if you have a son, then you have the commandment to tell that son. And if you don't have a son, you're exempt. So if you have a daughter, you're exempt. If you don't have any children, you're exempt. No, this little lemor comes in to tell you, no, even if you don't have a child, even if you don't have a son, even if you don't have a child at all, you still have to tell the story. And then Talmud lemor she'al kol panim tzarich lagid. And here's something that I really love. Afilu beino levein atzmo. And even if nobody else is present at all, and you're all by yourself, you still have to tell yourself. The process of the telling of the story is so important that the story has to be told even if only your ears are hearing it, which is such a fantastic innovation from a narrative perspective, that I might think, I know this already. Why do I have to tell it again? But if we understand that the telling is shaping us, then we have to re-encounter the telling. Even if we are telling it to ourselves, we still have the power to do that telling for ourselves alone. And that impacts us. And therefore, we have both the higarata and the lemor, according to the Orach Chaim. Now, I just wanted to include this Rashi here because this is what we're all familiar with from the Seder. Asa Adonai li, God did for me, in our verse. Ramaz tshuva leven rasha. This is a hint about what we say to the bad, evil child, the wicked child. Lomar asa Adonai li velo lecha. So li here means to me and not to you. She'ilu hayita sham lo hayita chedai ligael. If you, wicked son, were there, you would not have been redeemed. This is just for me because you excluded yourself. So this is not your fate. And the spirit that I'm going in here is actually going to be a little bit different here about what the me is, but the language of God did this for me, li, is so immediate that it does invite us to think about what does it mean to say, God did this for me. So Torah Tmima, which is just pulling from the Gemara here. Asa Adonai li, b'chol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. In every generation, a person is obligated to see oneself as if that one person came out of Egypt, as it says. I'm sorry, I did the translation myself here, so it needs a little editing. It is because of what God did for me when I went free from Egypt. So this is the earliest layer where we see this term coming in. B'chol dor vador, chayav adam lirot et atzmo. In every generation, a person has to see themselves as if they themselves came out of Egypt. It's in the Mishnah, and I just wanted to bring it out here because that's such a powerful understanding of what it is to say, God did this for me. In every generation, I myself came out of Egypt. That's the act of religious imagination that intrigues me so much here. To be able to teach our children that I came out of Egypt and you came out of Egypt. And your work here is to cultivate a life in which you can affirm, I myself came out of Egypt. And the Steinsaltz, the reason I picked the Steinsaltz here is because of the end. He goes through the same passage and he says, Uv'chol hadorot omer adam b'lashon asa Adonai li. In every generation, a person says, God did this for me. V'lo omer b'lashon lavotai. And you don't say, God did this for my ancestors. That in every generation, it's for me. That's what's so remarkable here. It never becomes the past. It never becomes the historic past. It always becomes one's personal past that one is attesting to. So how do we do this? How do we make it mine? How do we help someone know that I too came out of Egypt? I think one of the ways that we do this is by really exploring what it means to each of us to live in Egypt, to leave Egypt. We have to explore all of the metaphorical aspects in which Egypt and oppression are part of our lives. And this experience of being lifted out is contemporary and urgent. And now I've brought you the Mishnah from Psachim, and these are the ways that we do it. So first of all, this part of the Mishnah, this is what we do in the Seder. Mazgula kos sheni v'chan haben shoel aviv v'im ein lo dat baben aviv melamdo ma nishtana halayla ze mikol haleilot. So the attendants pour the second cup for the leader of the Seder, and here the son asks the father the questions about the differences between Passover and a regular night. And if the son does not have the intelligence to ask questions on his own, his father teaches him the questions. So, and then we go into Manish Tana. So the first way that we do this is by paying attention to each and every human being who's in front of us, that we don't make a blanket statement that is not a good fit for the person we're with. So we learn that every child needs to be approached in what actually speaks to their soul, and every human being in what speaks to their soul, so that they are addressed and are given a space to bring all of who they are into the telling of this story, into the asking of the questions about what this is, to make it their own. There's no question that's too silly or irrelevant or irreverent. And even though we have the wicked son and we play with that and the exclusion, I don't think that's actually in the spirit of the Seder, because we even include the wicked son as part of this process. So it's tailored to each person according to their needs. And now the next Mishnah. Rabban Gamliel haya omer, Kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach lo yatsa yedei chuvato. Rabban Gamliel said, anyone who doesn't say these things on Pesach hasn't fulfilled their obligation. Pesach, matzah, and maror. And then we continue down to, again, our verse, or the B'chol dor vador. So you can see my cursor. B'chol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves as if they themselves came out of Egypt. Shneimar, as it says, v'higarat levincha beyomahu lemor, and you tell your child on this day, saying, Ba'avur zeh asa Adonai li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim, because of what God did for me when I came out of Egypt. Lefichach, anachnu chayavim lehodot, lehalel, leshabeach, lefa'er, leromem, lehader, levarech, lehalel, ukales, mi she'asa lavotenu v'lanu et kol hanisim ha'elu, hotzianu me'avdut lecherut, mi'agon lesimcha, u'me'evel liyom tov, u'me'afela le'or gadol, u'mishiabud ligula, v'nomar lefanav, hallelujah. So, in each generation, a person must view himself as though he personally left Egypt. As it is stated, and you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of this which the Lord did for me when I came forth from Egypt. Therefore, we are obligated to thank, praise, extol, glorify, extol, exalt, honor, bless, revere, and laud the one who performed for our forefathers and for us all these miracles. God took us out from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a festival, from darkness to a great light, and from enslavement to redemption. And we will say before God, hallelujah. And then we recite Hallel. Okay. So what I wanted to point out with this Mishnah is that when we say that we ourselves came out of Egypt, it leads us immediately into this list, first, of all these positives, all the praise and the glory that we give to God, and then a list of couplets. God took us from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a festival, from darkness to a great light, from enslavement to redemption. These couplets are what I want to focus on, because it is the holding of these couplets that places us in a place to say hallelujah. The hallelujah, the praise God, comes not just when we have the positive side of the couplets, but having the dark side of the couplets enables us to hold that both possibilities are real in this world. We have known both, and we praise God for lifting us from one sphere of suffering to a sphere of being in a lighter place. So I'm going to link this back to the Griffith and Griffith. One of the things they do in their book that I really love is they give us this set of existential questions. What has sustained you? From what sources do you draw strength in order to cope? Where do you find peace? Who truly understands your situation? When you are afraid or in pain, how do you find comfort? For what are you deeply grateful? What is your clearest sense of the meaning of your life at this time? Why is it important that you are alive? To what or whom are you most devoted? To whom or what do you most freely express love? So when we're talking about our spiritual lives, it would be a mistake to focus overly on some notion of what is your faith. It wouldn't be a Jewish question anyway. We have a much more robust notion of how living with belief, trust, a lot of other dimensions, instead of just proclamations about who God is in this world. But what I love about these existential questions is that it's a very broad notion of our spiritual landscape. And looking at these questions in preparation for today, what I was aware of is that so many of these questions have an interesting link to the story of coming out of Egypt. So if you were to answer these questions in terms of this story, what has sustained you? So the God who brought me out of Egypt sustains me. From what sources do you draw strength in order to cope? I would say that I draw strength from knowing that I myself and my people and all those who've come before me have been in Egypt and have been liberated from Egypt. For me, that is a source of strength that enables me to cope with the hard times, with encountering the Egypts of today. And where do you find peace? One way that I can answer that is that I find great peace in knowing that the coming out of Egypt is a possibility that we return to over and over as a historic legacy and as a promise for all times, that I myself have come out of Egypt, and I can draw a sense of peace from believing that a coming out of Egypt is always a possibility. Who truly understands your situation? Well, the God who heard our cry knew that we needed to be rescued from Egypt. So one way of answering this question is that God understands our situation and sends people who also understand our situation, who become actors in this drama. And we, a community of people who have left Egypt, are committed to being with one another, understanding one another, and understanding all who encounter aspects of Egypt in their lives, all aspects of alienation and suffering. When you are afraid or in pain, how do you find comfort? For me, having a story of pain at the center of our spiritual life is a great source of comfort, that we don't cast the suffering to the side, but we actually make it the central narrative. When we gather around the Seder table, fear and pain are part of this experience, and they don't have the last say. For me, that's tremendously comforting. as we continue down these questions, I think that there's an aspect here, as you would find with any personal story, that this story, when it becomes personal, it is my story of leaving Egypt. So I have that tremendous gratitude to have been born into a tradition that teaches me that I came out of Egypt, that everything that I suffer in my own life is part of a larger collective narrative, so that I am never alone in whatever I am suffering. I am never the first, I am never the last, I am never alone. And I am so grateful for that, because if there's one thing that I know from my work as a chaplain, it's how profoundly the being with others in times of great suffering transforms that suffering, not by taking it away, but by knowing that I am with others who walk with me. And telling this story communally has that power. Now, this question, what is your clearest sense of the meaning of your life at this time? I think there's an invitation here to refract the meaning of our life in terms of this story. So part of, for me, the meaning of my life is that my life didn't begin with my birth and does not end with my death. I participate in something that happened long before me, and God willing will continue long after me. And it is this story of being in places of great hardship with redemption being possible. I can go more into depth about why I would characterize that as the meaning of my life, but I don't see myself as an individual. For me, saying I came out of Egypt is linking my soul with the souls of all of our people who were born into Judaism and people whose souls led them to come into this Jewish community, which means that anyone can identify with this story. And I find that tremendously meaningful, because being a human being who is only for myself, I don't know what that means for me. Locating myself in something much larger than myself, that's where I start to have a sense of what it means to be alive, to be granted this tremendous gift of walking on this earth. So that leads us to the next question. Why is it important that I'm alive? Why is it important that I can do what I can do? The great gift that I've been given. And how do I dedicate my energy to doing what's most important for me to be doing? To what or whom are you most devoted? To whom or what do you most freely express love? So I know that for me, taking seriously what it means to be able to say, this is for what God did for me when I came out of Egypt, means that name that Noam Tzion gave me of Rambit means that I live in all kinds of centuries, in dialogue with human beings and the divine through all of this time that locates my purpose, both in my very specificity and way beyond my specificity. And that's what it means for me that I came out of Egypt. I can feel my legs walking. I can feel that sand. I take it as a spiritual practice to nourish that experience. And finally, the Griffith and Griffith that I want to come back to has to do with those pairs that I was highlighting before in the Mishnah. Each existential crisis state is itself one half of a couplet of emotional postures: despair versus hope, meaningless versus purpose, helplessness versus personal agency, isolation versus communion, resentment versus gratitude, sorrow versus joy. Despair, meaninglessness, helplessness, isolation, resentment, and sorrow each represent a retreat from purposeful activity, a readiness to quit responding to challenges, whether they be mental or physical ones. These are states of breakdown in which coping actions become chaotic and ineffective. As such, they constitute states of vulnerability to illness. So our ritual of telling the story of being in Egypt, telling the story of leaving Egypt, and then moving into the hallelujahs, when we hold these couplets together, is a cultivation of agency and hopefulness, that the great challenges that we face are met with the possibilities in these couplets. So we can encounter our helplessness and our agency, and holding them together means that we don't just give in, because we live both with the reality of the suffering and the endless possibility of the redemption, of the moving from the suffering into a place of being able to celebrate, which is what the hallelujahs are about. And the telling of this story, as we do in the Seder, as we do when we imagine ourselves and know ourselves to be the ones who ourselves came out of Egypt, gives us a chance to hold together all the complexity of being a human being with a great affirmation that in the end, there's a possibility of coming into the hallelujah. And we hold that out for one another in the telling of this story. So we make space for all that is broken, and we offer this great breath into a wholeness that has been with us historically and in our own person, that we bring into ourselves through this memory, through this telling of the tale, through this encountering it in this moment, and in doing that, in shaping a future in which hallelujah is possible. Okay, I'm going to stop here for Rabbi Andelman.
Okay, so many wonderful comments coming in. So, as well as questions. So maybe I'll just start with a comment that's pulling together things that a few different people said. One person wrote that, you know, part of what's powerful for her about the retelling of the story of the Exodus every year is that she's a different person each year when she tells that story. And someone else wrote a really amazing comment about how, you know, we have, I don't have it right in front of me, but that we have, that a person can have more than one Egypt in their life, and that what seems at a certain time to be a liberation might later turn out to be actually another Egypt from which one requires liberation. So just kind of a deep thought there, but the point being, whether it's the Exodus story or all kinds of personal stories, I think, you know, what you're sharing with us and really pushing us to think about is, and connecting to, you know, to the mandate of the Haggadah and of the Torah, that, you know, retelling it, there's no such thing as telling the story once and then you've told it, because it really means something different each time. So I just want to share some of those comments. There was also a little bit of a challenge. So one person wrote, you know, is there kind of a downside to connecting to past stories so personally, and I think specifically the Exodus. He writes, so aside from identifying with slavery and oppression, does it also make us as a people more insecure? So I guess, and you could, I think, broaden the question to, are there stories that maybe it's not good to relive and keep dwelling in and keep reinterpreting?
So I love the reflections that you shared, and the question is a great question. In the way that I'm thinking about this story, I'm holding that the story that we are commanded to know, to tell and to know that is our own, is not being slaves. It's leaving Egypt. So it's that liminal space of transition, which has as part of it being slaves, and has another part of it being liberated people who are on our way out of slavery. And if one way that I might answer this question is by saying, if we only identify as victims, there is a danger there. And if we only identify ourselves as liberated people, there is a danger there as well. It's that liminal space that enables us to have empathy for people who are oppressed, and for ourselves in the ways in which we experience oppression, and always seeing ourselves as becoming powerful agents in those pairs that I was just holding up from the Griffith and Griffith that I think are echoed in the Haggadah and in the Mishnah. So the politics of being victims and the drama of needing to always tell how we have suffered, I don't think that's the spirit of the verse here. I think it's about knowing where we've come from and knowing what became possible. And that, so very specifically, the going out. So if you think about the different ritual items at the Seder, for example, charoset. So we can say that that's the mortar. But in all of these different versions of charoset, whether it's an Ashkenazi version or a Yemenite version or a Spanish version or a Moroccan version, and we have all these different versions at our Seder table because my sister-in-law loves to make lots of different kinds of charoset. They're all really tasty. So through the ritual, we hold the suffering not by stripping away all of our capacity to cope with it. I think that the telling of the story and in framing which aspect of the story it is that we're telling is guiding us in making space for the suffering, but not flagellating ourselves into suffering that is beyond what we can cope with. The container itself lets us know that we're going to be able to hold this. So I wouldn't want anyone to experience this commandment to see ourselves as having come out of Egypt to tell us that we should limit ourselves or objectify ourselves as victims. I think it's a much more complicated picture than that.
Someone raised the wicked child, which is, like everyone's favorite topic at the Seder, but I think, what you're sharing gives a really different lens on that text. And this person is asking, if the wicked child's take is so different, I'm paraphrasing, does that mean that person's experience of the story was right? It's sort of highlighting that, right? Any story can be experienced differently by the people in it, and sort of reflected upon differently by the people who are involved. But then the Haggadah goes on to say that child wouldn't have been redeemed. So that's tricky there, right?
Yeah. In this moment, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the painful reality of cutoffs, and that not everybody has wanted to be part of this story. And I come from a family in which there were cutoffs, which are really painful when people don't want to be in each other's lives anymore. And there's a paradox with the wicked child that although you're saying you would not have been redeemed, actually, here you are. So are we really saying you would not have been redeemed, or are we setting a boundary to wake someone up? The dialogue continues. The wicked child appears every year, never goes away, that never gets resolved. Is that some part of ourselves that distances ourselves, that doesn't want to be part of the story? I think there's an opportunity to investigate the ways in which we exclude ourselves, and to have somebody call attention and say, you have to choose this story. Now, the language has a kind of definitive cutting off quality, but the context, I think, flips that on its head and really offers the wicked child an opportunity to say, do you want to be part here? You've shown up to the Seder, that's something. Are we really going to say you wouldn't have been redeemed? I don't know. I can't really embrace that in a literal way.
Some additional, we could keep going for a long time with what people have sent in. So one person wrote, connected to current events, so many women right now are questioning whether to tell stories of their abortions to their children, wondering if the result will be judgment or liberation. So that's a powerful comment in its own right. It also makes me think about how, just these deep rifts and divisions in our country. And I think part of it is how few individual stories people hear from each other or from people on the other side, or we've sort of, political players sort of create these bogeymen and these, sort of horrendously simplified or kind of twisted versions of other positions. And we forget that there are people behind all of these positions, and so much nuance and so much kind of a mix of individual experience. I wanted to share a comment. I don't know if you have another response to that.
Yeah, well, in my role as rabbi and chaplain, I've had the opportunity to counsel a lot of people who have dealt with pregnancy, either infertility or unwanted pregnancy, or pregnancies that are very much wanted, where the child will be born with birth defects and will not have the possibility of having life more than a few days or a few months or a few years, as people are making decisions about whether or not to terminate those pregnancies. And what I can tell you from my experiences being in those moments with people is that each person in each moment of making those decisions is doing their own work of answering those existential questions that we were looking at before. And really, what is my life about? What am I supposed to be doing with my life? And what is the impact of this life in formation on my life? And is it possible for me to carry this baby and still have my life, or will I be losing my life? I think that the depth of the spiritual issues that come up for people in that place of distress, which is its own particular Mitzrayim, needs to be deeply respected. So the characterization of abortion as an easy act is certainly not something that I recognize in everybody that I've been with in in making that decision. And whenever I encounter Jewish texts or try to teach something that I understand about our tradition, it is really about life and making choices for living our life. I think that the telling of this story is a ritual that is designed to help us know how to live our life. That is what the whole narrative approach is really about. Telling the stories that help us to understand what our life is about, what our life can be about. And it means that there's a lot of humility. So if I were going to bring this paradigm of saying that I myself went out of Egypt, I have to be very in touch with my own Egypt as I encounter the Egypt in somebody else. And in this case, in the question that was asked about making decisions about termination of a pregnancy, that whoever's listening to that story needs to come with a real openness to what this moment means in the life of the other. We're not in charge of it. And when we are holy listeners, we can help somebody tell the story, tell the story of where they've been, tell the story of where they are in this moment, and where they can imagine themselves going in the future. When you're carrying the beginning of life inside of you, that act of imagining a future or not being able to imagine a future is really at the crux of how a lot of people make that decision. Because if I can't imagine my own life continuing, then there's a way in which I would be sacrificing myself in order to bring another life into this world. And we're not asked to sacrifice ourselves in that way. So just to say one more thing about abortion, I was doing a little teaching recently and came across a text that talks about the 40 days that Moses spent on Mount Sinai receiving Torah. And the question is, why does Moses have to spend 40 days on Mount Sinai? And the answer is because it is 40 days from fertilization of an egg until gestation, until it becomes a fetus, an ubar. And so just as a fetus needs 40 days to achieve the status of an ubar, Moses needed to gestate for 40 days until he was ready to receive Torah. And I say this here because too often our conversations in this country about abortion are shaped by conception, that human life begins at conception, or a way of thinking about the evolution from the beginning of life until a human being is born, without a lot of the nuance and wisdom of the rabbis. And I think that emphasis on preserving life and knowing that sometimes there is great complexity, which is also bound up with what it means to live with an awareness of Egypt, puts us in a best position to make very difficult decisions that often cause us great sadness, but are the best that we can do.
Thank you for that. Do you want to return to your sources?
Sure, and then we'll have time for some more on the other side. I just have one more source that I want to look at together. Great questions, everyone. Okay, so the last source is from the Mishnah Torah, and this is a text that I learned this year at the Seder. I had a new guest at the Seder who said that Maimonides teaches it a little bit differently in the Mishnah Torah. He says, "B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam leharot et atzmo ki'ilu hu ba'atzmo yatsa ata mishiabut Mitzrayim." In every generation, one must show oneself, leharot, not lirot, to see, but leharot, which is the he feel, to be seen. Leharot et atzmo, to show oneself as if he himself came out right now from the slavery of Egypt. Shene'amar ve'otanu hotzi misham v'gomer ועל דבר זה ציווה הקדוש ברוך הוא בתורה, וזכרת כי עבד היית, כלומר, כאילו אתה בעצמך היית עבד ויצאת לחירות ונפדית. And regarding this, the Holy One, blessed be He, commanded in the Torah, remember that you were a slave, meaning to say, as if you yourself had been a slave, come out to freedom and were redeemed. So notice the three pieces here: had been a slave, came out to freedom, and were redeemed. So what's different in the Maimonides is it's not about how we see ourselves. It's about how we act in the world so that we are seen in that way by others. And what's beautiful here is, what does it mean to act with the knowledge that I came out of Egypt? It is the acting with those three things: with the knowledge of slavery, with the knowledge of coming into freedom, and the knowledge of redemption, which I believe is an awareness of the infinite worth of every person, the great vulnerability of every person, and the possibilities for redemption, the possibilities for transformation that adhere in every experience, which is really a cultivation of hope. So when I embody these principles in the way that I behave, I create a world in which the coming out of Egypt is a reality every day, is a shaping narrative that teaches us how to behave towards one another, how to expect that even people who are in the deepest depths have the capacity to come out into a redeemed life, never to give up that hope. That's how I understand what Maimonides has done with this, in turning it away from being how we see ourselves, which is largely private, to being a communal enterprise in how I live out my day, so that you see me as somebody who has gone through this remarkable experience of having been in a low place, having been lifted up, and being redeemed. I turn it back to you, Rabbi Andelman.
Thank you. That was beautiful. A few people asked about there was a lot of response to the story about Moshe and why he's there for 40 days. So a few people just asked for the source for that, if you know it offhand, which I don't. We can find it and add it to the source sheet on the series webpage. Maybe we'll do that.
Okay.
Or add a reference to it.
Okay.
This is a story from a little while back, but sorry, a question from a little while back, but a few people asked it. You were talking about agency with the redemption from Egypt, and sort of remembering not just the subjugation, but and I think you were abstracting that to, or applying that to sort of other low places that we've been. And a few people pointed out that there are many stories of enslavement of different kinds where we actually don't have agency. I mean, you could argue that that's the case in the Exodus story itself. Someone, of course, mentioned the Holocaust. So I didn't know if you wanted to maybe clarify how you were thinking about agency and all of this, or respond in a different way.
So I want to be careful not to overspeak, but I think that an attitude of agency, even in places where one might think there is no agency, helps us to be connected to a sense of meaning. So Viktor Frankl, in his logotherapy, meaning making, ascribes a lot of importance to the ways in which people could access acts of meaning, whether that was choosing to share a bite of bread when there was no bread, or the ways in which people held on to their humanity for themselves. even in places where other people might not see that they have the capacity. So I do think that there is a power to saying, I choose something. Maybe I have no power over the larger situation in which I am, that I've been thrust into, but something inside of this that I have the capacity to shape, even in a tiny way, makes a difference, is what Viktor Frankl would say, and I am with him on that.
Kind of still working to formulate this one question. So we've friends of different religious affiliations joining us all the time in this series, including some priests, which is wonderful. I know you work with clergy of other faiths all the time. So this person wrote how he connects very much to the Exodus story, but also to other stories in our Hebrew Bible, other stories of liberation. Joe had mentioned Joseph and his brothers, sort of suffering and transformation. Esther and the Purim story, and Ezra and Nehemiah. So he was asking sort of what's unique about this. I think like there's kind of maybe the most basic answer is that our tradition relates to this story very differently. It's national, it's foundational, it happens in the Torah, which has a different kind of status than the later books, and sort of it becomes the paradigm for the rabbis of all future redemption. So that's maybe a basic answer, but I don't know if you want to reflect differently on. It's an interesting question. Sort of, is there something beyond how the tradition has treated it that makes the Exodus different from other stories of liberation, makes it unique?
Well, I think I would go back to our verse in Exodus that tells us that we have to tell this story, and it's for what God did for me, that there is an eternal present tense in this story that is different from other stories. So when we connect with it, we connect with our deepest selves. That's really at the heart of what I wanted to talk about today. That there is that wicked son saying, really, do I have to put myself there? And it's so hard to put myself there. And why do I want to put myself there? But actually, yeah, if you can put yourself there, if you understand your own journey as living, it's almost like a palimpsest is when you have something that's been written and then something came and wrote over it and wrote over it and wrote over it. So all the layers are there on the one slab, all the layers. That's what this story is. So I'm written here, but this story is written here, and my soul and the soul of ancient Israelites live together, and we are asked in cultivating our Jewish souls to enter into this timelessness. That is really different from anything else. Nobody else is asking us to show up in that way. And we do it, and this is back to one of the pieces about ritual and ceremony. We do it on the Seder night with all of these aids. So the Sephardic telling of the story is you take the matzah, you put it on your shoulder, and you say, where are you coming from? I'm coming from Egypt. And where are you going to? I'm going to Jerusalem. And in all of these ways, the foods that we're eating, so that all of our senses are involved in locating ourselves right there, so that it's not far away from us. It's right here in our bodies, happening to me. It's mine. And when I tell it to my children, they don't hear it lavotai for my ancestors. They have to find access to it so it is theirs. And that's the only way that Judaism continues, because there are so many forces pulling us away, whether it's assimilation or oppression or alienation or all these factors that pull us away. But I think that really holding the sanctity of this story, transporting us so that what was then is now and is into our future, that is what keeps us safe with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God.
Just to say a little bit more about that's what keeps us safe with God. Can you just elaborate on that?
It's intimate and it has to be mine. And I tell this story. I tell this story of my Egypt and my coming out of Egypt. And I'm authoritative. Back to some of the theoretical pieces that I started with. It doesn't belong to somebody else. So I might say, when I was a kid growing up, so-and-so ran my Seder. But if I'm at my Seder now, I'm holding all the Seders that I was ever at and all the Seders that ever will be. And I'm the voice. And that's what keeps me safe, that it's not something that I observe as an outsider to somebody else's experience or somebody else's relationship with God. It has to be my relationship with God. And I have to know what it is to be in a place of needing rescue and knowing that rescue is possible and being able to say the hallelujah, that mishiabud mi'avdut lecherut, that I hold both of those together and God is intimately connected to it. It's mine. It's my experience. I'm authoritative. So yes, it's been given to me. I was born into this, or I chose this through conversion. However it is, it's mine. And I will tell it through my voice and make it my own. And I give it to the others who have to make it their own too. Because even though it's fully mine, it's also fully yours. And that's what I mean by cultivating that intimacy with God is where the safety is. When we get disinterested, when we think that it's interesting but doesn't really move me, I can take it or I can leave it, that's when I think we're in danger.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think that's my takeaway for sure from what you've taught us today. Right, because the Megillah, the Book of Esther, also, right, it tells us, okay, there's going to be a holiday each year, remembering this, but it doesn't tell us that we have to tell the story as part of that, as part of the observance of that. And certainly the rabbis don't take it in all of these ways and emphasize the telling of the story to oneself. So I'm just going to indulge, one more moment, since my sister was so kind to sponsor this session in memory of our dad, that you've really given me a new insight. Passover was he loved every holiday, but Pesach was, I think I would say, his favorite, and his favorite part of it was this passage that we've been dwelling on. And we had very long seders, so he especially loved how it ends with the more you tell, the more praiseworthy it is. That justified our seders going until 3 a.m. But he really loved this mandate of the Haggadah to make it relevant. And the insight that you've given me is it's the commandment to retell the Exodus story. It's really giving us a paradigm. Like, this is really how we should tell our stories in general, in an ongoing way that doesn't end and that connects us to all the different pieces, the parts that led us here and the parts that keep going. And it goes back to what you shared at the very beginning about each story has a future to it as well. And kind of one of his missions in life was to make us feel that we were part of the chain of Jewish tradition. And so that's maybe why he loved Pesach so much, because that's what it really, really pushes us to do. So thank you so much. I'm I think it was meaningful for everyone and not just for me, but it was especially meaningful for me today. And it's also going to make me think, and maybe all of us who participate in the future sessions in the series will have to think about what's kind of the retelling valence of the different stories that we're going to look at as well. How do they have echoes in present and future as well? So thank you so much for teaching us today, and also for the very profound reflection you shared related to abortion, which I'm sure you didn't expect to speak about today. Thank you.
Abortion
again.
is everywhere today. So
yes, right,
we're all prepared to talk about it always.
Thank you, and thank you to my sister for sponsoring in memory of our father, the storyteller, and hope everyone will join us again next week for one of the stories that has really kind of arrested our ethical sensibilities for hundreds and hundreds of years, which is the binding of Isaac, or the near sacrifice of Isaac. Our teacher next week will be Dr. Miriam Feldman-Kay, who's an adjunct professor for us this coming year at JTS, and her session is called Passion and Violence, a Contemporary Philosophical Reading of the Sacrifice of Isaac. So hope to see everyone next week, and thank you again to Rabbi Springer for teaching us today.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Thanks everyone for being here.